In your Mexican trip, you mentioned the name Kerouac and Cassidy. Is there? Those are interesting names. Could you tell us a little about the origin of those names, where they came from, and
Well,
who Cassidy was, and how he was related to Kerouac?
Yeah, the other character that's the principal character in Kerouac's On the Road is Neil Cassidy. Neil Cassidy was Kerouac's like blood brother, essentially. He wasn't his, his blood relative, but he considered him his best friend, his muse, his doppelganger in some ways. A lot of times, the public perception of Kerouac is of the wild, free-swinging, free-loving, pot-smoking, glutton for experience. That was Cassidy. Cassidy was a very charismatic guy. He was bisexual. He was lover to Allen Ginsberg. He hustled gay sex sometimes for money. But he also was an amorous, legend. He had all kinds of female lovers, was married at one time to 2 different women at the same time. He had a long career as a counterculture bohemian figure. He started with Kerouac in the mid-1940s, and he was with Ken Kesey when Ken Kesey took his famous bus trip across America in the 1960s that was depicted in Tom Wolfe's book, The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test. So Cassidy had a 20-year career as a handsome, muscular, fast-talking, charismatic Benzedrine addict who had his way with a lot of girls. He ended up, sadly, dying in Mexico, actually, and I visit the place that he died in the book. He died outside San Miguel de Allende at the age of 44, walking down the railroad tracks on his way to see a girl, and he was high on Benzedrine, it was cold, and he ended up passing out, maybe having a mild heart attack, and he died of exposure. So he died in 1968 at the age of 44, and Kerouac died the next year at the age of 47 of basically alcohol-related maladies. What they were as young men, though, was totally different. When they were in their 20s, Cassidy actually was in jail for car theft and other petty crimes. He had served in juvenile detention, and then he was in jail when he was 19. And he was writing these fascinating sort of stream of consciousness, sexually confident, energetic letters. One of them, the so-called Cherry Mary letter, was 20,000 words long. And he wrote them to Hal Chase in Manhattan. And Hal Chase was Kerouac's friend from Horace Mann Prep School. And Hal Chase said at one point, "Hey, Jack, you got to read these letters from this guy. Neil is in jail in Denver." And he said, "Why? What are they like?" He goes, "They are going to blow your mind." And he gave him the letters. Kerouac read the letters, instantly changed his idea about his style of writing. What became known as spontaneous prose was inspired by Cassidy's letters. He passed those letters around to Allen Ginsberg, to William Burroughs, to Lucian Carr, and they were all waiting for Neil Cassidy to visit New York, which he finally did the next year when he got out of jail at age 20. They were waiting for Neil Cassidy to come like they were waiting for the savior. Like, this guy just blew everyone's mind. Kerouac was athletic, handsome, charming, and Cassidy was that times 10. He just was able to mesmerize people with his rap, his what we now call somebody's rap, his way of talking. He charmed all kinds of ladies and other people, and he was kind of a con man, very interesting, charismatic figure. He appears in several of Kerouac's books. Sometimes he calls him Dean Moriarty on the Road. In another book, he calls him Cody Pomeroy. He wrote a book called Visions of Cody, which is just about Cassidy. He appears in Dharma Bums briefly. He appears in Vanity of Toulouse briefly. He's just a character that made Kerouac's career. I mean, without Neil Cassidy's character in Kerouac's books, they're just travel stories. He had the charismatic central figure that drove the engine of those stories.
I just wanted sort of a contrast to Kerouac and Cassidy. In your book, you spend a lot of time trying to find places to swim, bicycle, gyms where you're always trying to keep fit, you and your friends that you're traveling. It's such a contrast. Did you bicycle around Gettysburg?
Yeah, we biked around New York, we biked around Gettysburg. We biked around New Orleans, which almost killed me because it's like 100 degrees there. 100 degrees, 100% humidity. My buddy's from Florida, and he's just finished the triathlon circuit for the summer, so he had done, 50-mile bike ride, 2-mile swim, 20-mile run. So he goes, "How you doing? You all right?" I'm like, "Oh yeah, I'm doing great. This is fun. I feel like I'm gonna die." And then we went swimming in this lake in Georgia, and some lady at a fruit stand told us, "I would swim in there. There's catfish with heads as big as shovels, and there's old bull gators in there." And I'm like, so my buddy's like, "No, there isn't. She doesn't know what she's talking about. There's no gators this far north." So then we're swimming, and it's pea soup warm, and it's a half-mile across the lake and a half-mile back. So you're out in the middle of the lake, it's probably about 100 feet deep, and all of a sudden you start thinking about, like, there's some alligator out here, I'm dead. So that was fine, we got through that swim, nothing happened. Then when we went down to the Gulf of Mexico, we swam in the ocean. And it was 3 years post-Katrina, but it still looked like Katrina had just hit. It was like, my buddy described it as swimming on the planet of the apes. Houses toppled over, nobody on the beach, no tourists in sight. And we went out for a swim in the shipping lane, so that you could see big oil tankers out there. And the day before, when I was swimming in the lake in Georgia, I cut my foot on a rock. I was in shallow water, I didn't know it, and I was swimming and my feet were, I was kicking, and I hit a rock and it burst open my toe and I was bleeding. So in a lake, no big deal, like you just wash it off, you get out, stick a Band-Aid on there. The next day, we go swimming in the Gulf of Mexico, and we get out in the shipping lane, so it was only 6 feet deep. It wade out like 150 yards, you're only in water this deep. But then there's markers. On the other side of that, it's depthless, it's like hundreds of feet deep. So I start swimming, I lose track of where I am, and I get out into the shipping lane. So my buddy's swimming a nice straight line. I'm swimming out here, I look up and there's an oil tanker, it's probably like a quarter of a mile away, it looks like it's right there. I was like, uh-oh. So I turn around, I see these pillars in the ground saying, "Danger, do not go beyond this point." So I start swimming back and I look down and blood is trailing off my toe, and I'm like, it's all sharks out there. So like my buddy's like, "What are you doing?" I go, "I don't know. If it wasn't a dangerous place, we made it dangerous by like trying to do the things we did." So it was fun.
Great to be young.
Was he Kerouac a contemporary of Ferlinghetti?
Yeah, Ferlinghetti was his friend. And,
So was that a place you visited in San Francisco?
yeah, I was in San Francisco for like a few days, and I didn't go to City Lights bookstore, and I explained why I didn't go to like some of the exact places. When Kerouac's book was being celebrated in 2007, the New York Times sent a reporter across the country, and the Boston Globe sent John Element, or one of the reporters, on one of the trips, and they were trying to reproduce exactly what Kerouac did, so there was no story. I mean, there used to be a drugstore on this corner, and Jack Kerouac had a soda here with Neil Cassie. And then they would go to an auto parts store. There used to be a bar right here, and in this bar he listened to jazz music, but now, as you can see, it is a auto parts store. It was dull. So when I was ready to start taking the trips, at the very beginning of the book, I explained that I went to this guy Amram's house. And actually, when I visited with Amram, we had this talk, and he told me some stories about Kerouac, which I capture in the book that hadn't been published anywhere, things that happened to them. And then at the very end of the trip, the hitchhiking trip, I'll read this little part. This is me and David Amram, who was Kerouac's friend. At the train station, he's bringing me back to the train. At the train station, we hurried through the ticket line as a few late arriving passengers waved goodbye to their relatives and two young lovers share a final embrace. The dwindling light gleams on the shiny corrugated side of the train, and it gives out a loud chuff of impending movement just as the conductor pops his head out and yells, "Board!" Standing on the platform with my bag slung over one shoulder, I feel like Humphrey Bogart. As the train is about to depart, some of the mirth fades out of Uncle Dave, and he turns to rest a hand on my shoulder. "Remember, son, you're not a Civil War reenactor," he says with a little smile. "Just go, and have a funkitissimo time of your own. So, when I got back from the first trip and I had that discussion with NORCAM, I called my literary agent in New York and I said, you know what? I'm gonna follow generally the track that Kerouac took, but you can't go back to 1947, and I'm not Jack Kerouac. So I'm gonna basically do my own thing with my friends in the spirit of Kerouac, and then I'm gonna reflect on his book, not as a scholar or a historian, but as a writer who was influenced by this other writer, and how those influences work, how one artist influences another, even though the time frame may be different and my background is different enough to where I'm not writing in the same style, I'm not doing the same things that he did. When he was doing it, he was 25. I'm doing it like Helena was saying, we're exercising, we're still playing rugby, and we're doing stuff that he didn't even live to my age. He was dead 6 years younger than I am now. I don't want to be him, you know?
In the class you teach, do you teach Cassidy's writing also?
Yeah, there's a book that we use called The Portable Beat Reader, and it's got several letters from Cassidy, and then it's got a big chunk of his book, the first third. And then I also had the kids buy Jack Kerouac's letters 1940 to 1957, and you get to see the early letters that Cassidy wrote directly to Kerouac and back and forth. And before Kerouac got famous, which he called becoming fame mouse, he was not suited to be famous. He did not like being famous. He didn't know how to be famous. So the letters from the late 1940s show these guys at their energetic best. And my students actually are reading those, and for next Tuesday we're going to be talking about